don't understand why President Trump said that, because at other times he has said correctly that instituting new sanctions on Russia and what he calls secondary tariffs, which would punish the countries and the companies from countries that are helping Russia sell its oil around the world, would have a significant impact on Russia's economy. So President Trump understands that. And there are many in the Trump administration, and by the way, also many in Congress, including many Republicans who are from President Trump's party, who believe the only way to get Putin to agree to a fair ceasefire and settlement is if there's more pressure put on his economy. So it's the institution of sanctions that is likely to put more pressure on Putin and cause him to be more reasonable at the negotiating table. And in my view, it's not just the sanctions. It's the sanctions plus increasing the support in terms of weapons and equipment that Ukraine needs. If both of those are done together in parallel, that's what is likely to cause Putin to say, I can't win this war, and I'm suffering too much, and my people are suffering too much, and my economy is in the tank, and that it could possibly bring him to the negotiating table.
David, Kirill Budanov, head of Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, believes that Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil refineries have caused greater damage to Russia's economy than any international sanctions. How significant is the economic impact of Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil refineries compared to international sanctions? And how have these strikes affected Russia's oil production and export capabilities?
I think he's right. And based on what international observers are saying, it is having a significant impact on Russia's economy, although it hasn't yet changed the conduct and actions of Putin as the commander-in-chief of Russia. They continue to, make attacks on Ukraine and continue to launch offensives against Ukraine. So far, even though I believe that Russia's economy is hurting because of those strikes on the oil sector and the oil facilities in Russia, it hasn't changed behavior. But this is why things like providing tomahawks, which would allow Ukraine to strike much deeper into Russia and hit some of the oil facilities and oil infrastructure they have not been able to hit yet, could be the type of thing that changes the situation and does cause Putin to realize that he needs to get a ceasefire.
Some Indian oil refineries are preparing to reduce imports of Russian crude oil after U.S. President Donald Trump said that India has assured him of its intention to stop purchases to help end the war in Ukraine. What are the main factors influencing Indian oil refineries to consider reducing imports of Russian crude oil? How significant is India's commitment to stop purchasing Russian oil in the context of global efforts to end the war in Ukraine?
To me, this is very important because India is the world's largest democracy. And even though it's a democracy, it has more in common with the United States, with Ukraine, with the West. It somehow has been playing both sides. And getting India, which is also the largest country in the world in terms of population and has great needs for resources, oil and gas, to getting India to be less dependent upon Russia and to understand and recognize that its future economic relationships with the United States and Europe are much more important than its economic relationship with Russia is essential to removing a buyer of Russian oil and gas that is providing a lot of the revenues that Russia is using to build up its war machine and continue the illegal war in Ukraine. And there's just no reason why India, which is our friend, the United States friend, a longtime ally, and a democracy, should be supporting Russia in this way. And President Trump is right to use sanctions and what he calls secondary tariffs on India to coerce India into reducing its purchases of gas and oil from Russia.
What about China? Because I see that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent will speak by phone on Friday with Chinese Vice Premier to discuss the ongoing trade negotiations between the United States and China, as a near-Trump administration official told CNBC's. Additional details about the call, including the specific time it would take place or the next steps to be discussed, were not immediately clear.
It's hard to know what China is going to do because, as you correctly said, China has a lot of different disagreements with the United States. And the negotiations between the US and China and the diplomacy between our two countries is on a broader array of issues than just Ukraine, although Ukraine is an important part of those discussions. But because of the tariffs and because of disagreements over trade and the trade imbalance that the U.S. has with China, and also criticisms by the U.S. of things that China does that are unfair, like stealing intellectual property from the U.S. and from U.S. companies, there is a lot to try to work out with China. Now, President Trump says he has a really good relationship with President Xi. And so when they do sit down together, if they do meet in person, and there have been discussions about a meeting in person happening soon, he needs to use that relationship and that friendship to try to get China to be more on the sidelines of the war in Ukraine. And China isn't directly providing a lot of significant weapons to Russia, but we know China is providing component parts and equipment that is essential to Russia. And also, we know that China, like India, is one of the biggest purchasers of oil and gas, and that's fueling the Russian economy.
David, and also about NATO security, NATO will not allow Moscow to violate borders. In the event of new provocations, Russian aircraft must be shut down, says Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. What are the reasons behind NATO's current lack of direct military action in response to repeated Russian provocations? Because we see drones, aircrafts, submarines.
Well, NATO has the NATO countries whose airspace have been invaded by Russian drones. They have authorized shooting down those drones. They've shot down some Russian drones. I think this woke everybody up around the world that the things that Ukraine was saying about how Russia won't stop in Ukraine if it's successful in Ukraine are true and genuine, because the fact that Russia is testing the borders of other countries, including the Baltic states and the Scandinavian states, which are part of NATO, shows that he wants to see if he can take more territory, to have more influence, operate on these sovereign countries in violation of international law. And so NATO collectively would be wise to take any provocation seriously and to respond and retaliate in order to send a message to Russia that this is unacceptable, and that if Russia continues, it could result in more hostile actions between NATO as a collective force and Russia.